Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Tuesday night Energion Hangout. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, I thank you for your presence. I pray that you would send your Spirit to be with us, guide us to hear whatever lessons you would have us hear from your word in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, tonight I'm talking with Drew Smith and David Cartwright, both of whom have done some significant studies on the sayings and the rhetoric of Jesus, and I'm going to throw the hard question to David first, which is in the title of our program tonight. So, did Jesus contradict himself?
Well, that is, I guess, the question that I was trying to answer in the book, Wounded by Truth and Healed by Love. It's something that kind of has been bugging me for, I guess, as I say in the preface, since elementary school, because there seem to be recurring things that certainly appeared that way. And he who is not, for us is against us, who is not against us is for us, and this kind of thing goes on and on. So that's... probably the short answer is I would say not really, but it sometimes appears that way.
Okay, we were since you just finished a series, and while I'm doing this, let me put up the links here. You were just finished a series of blog posts on our Energion discussion network, and I have those up now on the screen. Right now, if you just go to energion.co/discuss, all three of them are on the main list. But the key one for today is that last one on what did Jesus say, and you got into the interesting question of how do we know what Jesus actually said, because that's not that easy. You used the example. I'm going to take those links down now for a moment, but you used the example of the Sermon on the Mount versus the Sermon on the Plain, and of course we could keep for some further discussion. Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain is an interesting difference in itself. But laying that aside, we have "You shall be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect" in Matthew 5, and in turn in Luke you have "You shall be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful." And just to make sure, I mean, these are verbally very similar other than that one word. So the suggestion would be that we're looking at possibly versions of the same saying. So actually, let me pass to Drew for a second. What are some of the steps, or how do we answer this question, what did Jesus say? I mean, I'm guessing that you probably don't go with buy a red letter Bible and go for the letters you read.
Flip a coin. No, I mean, there have been different approaches and different methodologies of trying to get at what Jesus actually said. You move from form criticism to source criticism to redaction criticism and all of these other things. None of those were very fruitful in trying to get at what the actual historical Jesus said. I think we're just left with the four Gospels, and of course others that come along. But the interesting thing about it is that the early church didn't seem concerned that there were contradictions, differences, variances in there. They preserved a fourfold gospel, which is interesting in and of itself. But I don't think we can actually get what Jesus actually said, the words that he said. I think you start, with Mark as an interpreter, and then you run into Matthew and Luke, and then of course John as interpreters. And I think we could consider Matthew and Luke as interpreters of Mark, adding their own material and whatever the source material they may have, the hypothetical cue and stuff. But it's a difficult question, and I'm not sure that anything has been developed that could tell us, or from a methodological standpoint, could get us back to what Jesus actually said.
Okay, so several questions come out of that. But first, let me tell our viewers that we do have the Q&A app active if you want to either make comments or ask questions. The Q&A app will work. If you came in through YouTube, there'll be a link that's put across the bottom that you need to click. If you came in through Google Plus, you're already ready. Go down to the lower right-hand corner and you'll find a little button down there, and so you can ask questions or make comments. So there's a couple of questions that come out, but the first one is how much of a problem is this? I know that you, Drew, you preach as well as having academic background. So both you and David have, you faced congregations and preached about material from the Gospels. How much does this "we're not absolutely certain what Jesus said" impact, say, sermon preparation?
In terms of I'm the kind of person, I take an approach where I take Mark as Mark, Matthew as Matthew, Luke as Luke, John as John, and deal with them on their own. Now, I might compare and contrast what they might say, but I think you have to take Mark on its own value and the way it is put together, the literary context, the narrative flow, the characters, and all of these other things, and what Jesus said. And so, for example, if I'm leading a study and the church member says, well, what about what Matthew says? And I say, well, we're dealing with Mark right now. We can deal with Matthew at a different time. We can compare and contrast this, and we can propose reasons as to why one reads one way, one reads the other, why Matthew might have changed what Mark said or changed the order of events, or, these sorts of things. To me, it's from a historian point of view, it's a difficult task, but from a preacherly point of view, I think it can be handled in a way that shows respect for each evangelist as they're writing.
Okay, so let's turn back to David, since you've written a book where you have talked about you've dealt with the different versions of some of the sayings. And in your last essay that that I mentioned, that's the one, what did Jesus say, that was just published, I think, yesterday. You talk about this, you talk about this difficulty. So, and also, let's bring in your answer to the first question. You don't really prefer the term contradiction in the first place. So, do you find some way to get light from looking at the different versions of the statement of a particular saying?
Yes. One of the things I would say, what Drew was talking about, is basically the way I was taught in divinity school and proceeded probably for 40 years. And I would basically try to stay within each gospel as I was doing it. But then and I always kind of felt like there was this other conversation going on around me in the back of my head that I was not dealing with. And so I guess that's why this search and study came about. And then I realized that a lot of these opposites or contradictions were not just between writers, they are within the gospel themselves. Mm-hmm. I know that several of the sermons that I've done are both the opposing passages come from the same gospel. So that led me to think that, well, maybe there's more to what Jesus is saying than just that he's saying what Mark says he says or Luke says he says. The example I was given back in seminary was that was just when stereos were coming out. And so the professor said, it's like listening to a symphony on a stereo versus a mono record. Well, now I guess it would be digital 5.1. We'd be enriched by that. And I think that's probably a good analogy, although, like I said, it didn't totally solve it for me because I had an Old Testament professor who was also saying that we needed to preach the whole gospel and the whole canon, and so there was a contradiction set up within professors at the same time I was dealing with this, and I guess I carried it on into the ministry trying to come to some peace with it, which resulted in this book.
Yeah, well, I would note that I think that very often, and a lot of times in teaching, because I'm not a preacher, but in teaching classes like Wednesday nights or Sunday school and so on series, that my desire will be, I want to look at Mark, or I want to look at John, and this is what Jesus, the Markan Jesus, the Lucan Jesus, the Matthean Jesus, Johannine Jesus. So we have these four pictures, but many times people are not satisfied with the four pictures. They have the fourfold gospel, and the question that I get is, so who was Jesus actually? I mean, can you say something about not Mark and Luke and Johannine Jesus, but just Jesus? And I'm wondering, I don't know if you've run into that from the people in the class, Drew, but what would she say to that question?
Well, I would say this. I would say even those closest to him didn't know who he was. I mean, I think, and David, I didn't get a chance to really read your book. Henry sent me a PDF file of it, and I was able to scan it pretty quickly.
Sure.
I'm going to go back and read it more in-depthly, but it sort of reminded me of a couple of books. One from the mid to late 70s, I believe, by Frank Kermode, called The Genesis of Secrecy, in which he comes from a literary point of view, and he talks about Mark is all about secrets, that it never really meant to understand. And his launching point, of course, is that famous quote from Isaiah that Jesus quotes in Mark 4, when the disciples ask him about speaking in parables, and he says, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but to others I speak in parables, so that seeing they won't be able to see, and hearing they won't be able to hear. So Jesus is intentionally, and so what Kermode does is he talks about insiders and outsiders, because the gospel does have insiders and outsiders, and the readers are always supposed to consider themselves outsiders. The danger is if you consider yourselves insiders and you have it figured out, you don't really have it figured out. And that seems to be the portrait of the disciples. Jesus says, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom. They still don't understand. And so I think that, that's the way we are supposed to read the gospel. We're supposed to wrestle with it and grasp it and stuff like that. The other book was came out in mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, by Tom Thatcher, who teaches at, he teaches up to Cincinnati, but his book is called Jesus the Riddler, in which he talks about the way Jesus speaks and the way Jesus talks is supposed to be a riddle, because he wants people to, in other words, I'll give you an example. I'm leading a Sunday school class where I'm preaching right now, and there's a group of about 10 or 15 of us. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark. We've been every Sunday studying the Gospel of Mark since the beginning of this year, January, and we're only in chapter 12. And so, because the people keep coming back and saying, why wasn't he more clear? Why wasn't he more straightforward? And I said, because it's about this mystery. It's about this this ambiguity, if you will. I don't know if that answered your question, and I actually forgot what the question was. I'm sorry.
I don't really care that much on whether we got the answer to the original question. I was just giving you a chance to talk.
Okay. All right.
And you did. I was wondering, though, David, if you have any response to that, because you also preach and you also get the questions.
Right. I'm not familiar with the two books that you talked about, but I think the approaches sound pretty within the pale of what I'm used to, and would I think I could get something from them. I guess whether it preaches or not to me is whether it connects.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
are we dealing with an issue that people really are concerned about? One of the things that I sent my book to a fellow classmate in the divinity school, and what he came back was and said, "This book is for all the people who are disappointed in the church and don't want to have anything to do with it." And I was really surprised because I thought I was dealing with the people in the church who did want to deal with it. So it was a different perspective from. He said these are all the questions that people are asking because they have been disappointed and won't come into the church. So it opened up a new venue for me.
Right.
Well, I think that for in many churches, and I'll just have to say, on my own website, henryneufeld.com, I have this tagline is, "I help you find the right questions."
There you go.
Which, if you talk to me long enough, I'll tell you that I really can't help you very much finding the right questions, but finding the right questions is the right thing to be doing. So the question here, I guess, is, I could go all kinds of ways from this, is what does this say about the nature of our discipleship, the nature of learning about and following Jesus as an individual, that Jesus doesn't seem to be that much about the answers. I mean, I would observe, even if you stick with one gospel, you're still going to find that it's pretty rare that Jesus actually answers the question that somebody asks him. Do either of you want to jump in on that?
Oh, I think you're exactly right there. I think, in our minds, we want certainty. We want certainty about things. We want stability. We want answers. And Jesus is not the one to give us answers, and that frustrates us. Unless we sort of lower Jesus down to, these few sayings that we will agree with and stuff. But the more mysterious sayings that we try to understand and interpret and grasp, there for us to continue to wrestle with and continue to question.
I firmly be right with you. Yeah, I agree.
So probably neither of you are thinking that not having a scientifically firm compendium of the very true, absolutely original sayings of Jesus is not really that much of a problem from your point of view as ministers in the church, ministers of the gospel. Would you don't find that to be really a problem?
No, I don't. And again, I would go back to, if we accept the canon as it is passed down to us, we have a fourfold gospel in which the early church rejected Tatian's diatessaron. The melding and forcing together of the four gospels into one. They rejected that outright and went with the fourfold gospel. So I think they were happy with it. I can be happy with it as well. I think it lends itself to be more intriguing to me because it does lead to more questions.
I was just looking up while you were talking, Paul, who's often seen as kind of on the other side and the man with who's giving answers, but 1 Corinthians 8, in verse 2, right after he said, knowledge puffs up, love builds up. If anyone thinks that he knows something, he doesn't yet know it as he ought to. That's one of those really frustrating statements, because no matter how much you know, you're being told that it isn't working.
Yeah. Well, Paul is dealing with a split in the church in Corinth where there's a group of people that think they have all this spiritual knowledge, and that's why he uses this idea of puffed up,
It seems so un-Pauline. I know he says that, but he always seems like to me that he thinks he knows exactly what.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, that's for sure.
Paul is an interesting character, and I mean, if we would wanted to, we could sit down here and say, you know, did Paul contradict himself? And my guess is, even if we took the most reduced Pauline corpus that we could, we'd have to come to the conclusion that he did. You know, Paul sets up an awful lot of hard to resolve conflicts with the way he approaches subjects.
Yeah.
You know, you're saved by faith, by grace through faith. Works has nothing to do with it, but you better get to working because, you know, all these horrible things.
That's one of them.
So it's kind of interesting. I always love trying to translate Paul's sin list because he has, you know, they're actually difficult because he has so many near synonyms, and you're trying to come up with English words that are different.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, I've got an audience question, so I'm going to bring that in at this point. And once I've asked it, I'm going to actually step away from the camera because I want to grab a book off of my shelf. You know, speaking of what we just, the last question, talking about making the Gospels work together. So let me get this question. Okay, I left the church of my childhood because questioning was not encouraged. I wonder why we are reluctant to say, I don't know, and certainly it seems to be appropriate in regards to God. Do you admit to I don't know with your congregations?
All the time.
Yeah.
How do you go just outright, openly, just, okay, I don't know things? I'm going to step aside here. You'll probably be able to hear me. I'm grabbing a book off my shelf, provided it's here, actually. Here it is. My office is a great mess. So
yes, so was mine.
Yeah, basically, there's really, I guess, not much to discuss on that, since you both say, yeah, I'll say I don't know. It hasn't been a thing that the church has wanted to do a great deal. And that may be, I think, David, why your colleague said that you're talking to people who are, you know, outside of the church and don't want to go, and that is that the church has tried to present itself as a center of answers in many cases. Now, I know many pastors and many churches that are not like that, but I also know many where I grew up that were very much like that. That, you know, they had the answers and they did not want to have any questions that didn't fit in, and they certainly were never going to admit that they didn't know something, because then you could think about it for yourself.
Exactly that, and there's plenty of those around still. I think, from what I can see, I grew up in a congregation that was very open at that point, and so and as a disciple of Christ, and very unafraid of questions. And then when I went to college, it was about the same thing. In divinity school, I found there were a lot of people around that were much more orthodox than I was, and so I had to deal with all of this newfound. It's not the same kind of conservatism, but it certainly was orthodoxy, and so it was a real stretch, and probably very good for me, but not many things are settled in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. In fact, we seem to be very good at not settling anything, and so I think we lose people because of that too. Because I've even had people say, you know, this is way too much freedom than I can handle. You know, it takes a pretty mature approach to this to deal with it.
Is there a way, and again, this is a question for either of you, to deal with having the freedom people and the I need some structure people in the same congregation successfully?
That's a good question.
It's a very good question, and I do remember two people in the congregation on opposite sides of the pole. My extremely liberal person thought I was very conservative, and my very conservative person thought I was very liberal, and so and how they came to that conclusion, I don't know if I know, but I was trying to be biblical, and I hope that's what it was at this point.
Yeah, that's when you get shot out from both sides, right?
Yeah, because those two people could not even be in the room with each other, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I'm not a full-time pastor, but it seems to me that the structure itself would be the community coming together to have conversations about it in the best way possible. Now, obviously, you're going to have people on opposite ends who are not going to speak to one another. They're going to be entrenched in their views. But it seems to me that the more conversations and the more honest conversations we have about these things, and I think it would give maybe perhaps some people who are seeking that structure, but it would also be a place of questioning and encouraging those questions.
Right. That's an ideal community, I think, which hopefully does exist.
Yeah.
But in a way, what we're trying to do as Christians is create community, and community is going to involve a certain amount of compassion and concern for one another coming over the level of the importance of the doctrinal position. I would quote, and I know Drew Smith knows, I was using in my study of John on Thursday nights, I was using the book by Harold Weiss, Meditations on According to John, and we're releasing Meditations on the Letters of Paul from him next year, which I'm really enjoying reading as part of the editorial process. But when I asked him a similar question to this, he told a story about a man who had been excluded from the friendship of his own brother. And what he said is he cannot see any way that any position that we hold should ever exclude us from from the friendship and the fellowship, let's say, of our brother. And that may be a little bit extreme, and I'm sure the structured people find that hard. But it's, I guess I've encountered this difficulty enough times that I certainly like to see if we can find a way to, work together in community and let the questioners and the questioners and the more structured people, I'm getting a little bit incoherent about that, questioners and more structured people actually benefit from one another.
Well, I think that's again what Paul was trying to do.
Yeah, and Paul, I don't know, Paul may be, he may be a good example of somebody who's trying to fight between a questioning and a structured side of himself. Because he really does.
Yeah, yep, that's right.
Anyway, before I go, usually about the half-hour point, I do a little bit of advertising and talk about your books, which I will in a minute. But first, I was going to hold up this one, Jesus According to Scripture, Darrell L. Bach. I'm guessing Drew is probably acquainted with that book. I don't know if because it's not as much central to the preacher. I use this book in particular because I want to know how a harmonizer harmonizes a gospel story. Essentially, if you were to take a synopsis of the Gospels, and compare the stories, this is done in that order with, Bach presents ways of reconciling, all of the various accounts, which very often come down to you have Jesus crosses the sea and casts the demons out of a demon-possessed man. And there's one, and at another time he crosses the sea and casts the demons out of two demon-possessed men. And we come up with there must have been two incidents.
So, according to that reason, then you have the action, Jesus' action in the temple in John at the beginning of his ministry, whereas in the Synoptics at the end of his ministry, that argument would say he did it twice, which is very unlikely.
Well, I think as a matter of fact, and I haven't looked recently enough, so I'm not going to say this for certain. I think that Bach does in fact maintain the possibility of two cleansings of the temple, and so there the key becomes we're going to explain the story and explain the differences, and the key thing is to know what Jesus actually did or what Jesus actually said. If I listened to Drew earlier, the key thing is that I'm struggling with the issues that the life of Jesus raised. Would that be a fair statement, Drew?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was just interested because you were talking about the diatessaron, which is, of course, an interesting early, and I just was interested that I actually have on my ready reading shelf on my desk next over here a book that is doing the very same thing. So,
right.
Well, before we go on and I hit you with more questions here, of course you keep agreeing and answering them in such short and concise ways. I mean, it's really hard. I want an argument, and y'all are just too agreeable. So here's our agreeable authors. They both have books published by Energeon Publications. We start with David Cartwright. There is his book, Wounded by Truth, Healed by Love, Reflections on the Paradoxical Teachings of Jesus. And he does a series of studies, and they are presented as they would be for sermons, which I understand he preached sermons on these. And about all I can say here, really in a concise form about the book, is that I think that you'll find that it opens up quite a number of possibilities in the way that you're going to read, the way you're going to understand, and most probably in the way that you're going to apply the gospel, because it is a little bit different of an approach. For one thing, he is not telling us to ignore the differences or to minimize the differences, but rather to learn from and grow from the differences. So that's the book, Wounded by Truth, Healed by Love, and we'll be getting some more discussion out of David Cartwright here in a few minutes. He can even correct me if I have mischaracterized his book, which has occasionally happened. So in any case, that's David Cartwright. He's a retired Disciples of Christ pastor, but my observation is that retired pastors seem to keep awfully busy, and one of the things he did was write a book. Drew Smith is the author of the book Reframing Irrelevant Faith. Reframing Irrelevant Faith is not specifically about the Gospels, but it's a great deal about the Gospel, which is to say, how are we going to take the teachings of Jesus into the 21st century. So it's a broad-based, I think, text on what Christianity, what followers of Jesus can say and do in the context of the modern world. And I should mention that Drew is also, he wrote his dissertation on a topic dealing with rhetorical criticism in the Gospel of Mark, which for those who aren't too much into biblical criticism, we should say deals with how the words are framed in order to present a message, and it can get fairly complicated in a gospel. You've got a lot of characters to deal with, a lot of sayings to deal with. Having mentioned the books, let me mention we do have one of these hangouts on air every Tuesday night. We get Energeon authors, and I try to make them say some controversial things so that you can all have an argument. Or sometimes sometimes I work as a peacemaker. Peace doesn't always sell books, though, so we have a certain motivation. In addition, every Thursday night I do a Bible study on YouTube. That's also at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we're on eschatology. And assuming that one of the articles I read in preparation today that says the world will end tomorrow is not correct, I will be on this Thursday night talking about why the world didn't end yesterday. And also on Friday, we have a group getting together that I'm not actually involved with, but it's Energeon authors from the left coast of the Atlantic and the right side of the political spectrum. We have Elgin Hushbeck. From the right side of the Atlantic Ocean and the left side of the political spectrum, we have Energeon Associate Editor Chris Eyre, and they take one or two guests and dig deeply into issues in religion and society, trying to bring an international perspective to that. That's at 1 p.m. Central Time on Friday. That is timed for our European viewers. And I think that pretty much covers all the advertising. If either of you would like to say anything to the audience about your books, feel free now. You can go ahead. Otherwise, we'll come in with the next question. So
you did a pretty good job.
I was going to say either I got it right or you don't really feel like correcting your publisher.
No, I don't know that.
Got it right.
Got it right.
Okay. Let's go back to your article on the Energeon Discussion Network, and folks, I will mention as part of the announcements the Energeon Discussion Network, and let me pop up that that link again. We are getting in groups of 3 posts by Energeon authors, and there are some really interesting topics. We've already been through some serious discussion about gay marriage. We've been through some serious discussion about creation and evolution, and now we have these. We had these 3 essays: what would Jesus do? What did Jesus mean? And what did Jesus say? And that's David Cartwright, who's our guest today. Now, in the third of those, what did Jesus say? We have, be ye therefore perfect. I had to memorize that one when I was elementary age. Be ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And it sounded pretty threatening. And then we have Luke, be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Now, if I was really wanting to work up something into a contradiction, I could pretty much go for that. Because to me, being merciful. Are you guys still there?
We are. I am now.
I just lost everybody for a second, and then you came back. As I was saying, being perfect sounds very threatening to me. Be merciful sounds pretty, sweetness and light. Let's be nice to one another. So, David, do you see that as a potential contradictory statement? How do you see the comparison between those two? These, for those who have been following us, these are from two different Gospels. Right now we're dealing with Matthew and Luke and Jesus.
Right. You know, I was called up short myself on this because I thought I had done a sermon on this, and when I went back and looked into the book, I realized it was not there. And so somehow or another, the 15, I didn't get this in, so I did the blog on it. Yeah, I think it can be seen as these are two opposite ways of proceeding, and I think we've had the judgmental perfection and the kind of loosey-goosey kindness on the other end, but hopefully there's more to both sides of that, it's more than being judgmental or just totally all-inclusive with no backbone at all. My overarching thing, my thing of the paradox is it's two opposing or complementary opposites that are really overarched by another truth that's larger than that. And so I think we're talking about the qualities of God, and somehow or another this goes back into a classic distinction about being just and being merciful that's right in the embedded in the notion of the Christian God to begin with. So it's a capsule of the whole big thing. You can pass this, you can deal with it as we do it with Christians and trying to how to act, but it's actually a reflection of how God does things, and that's a tension between justice and mercy that's very hard to resolve. I think it stays a tension. I guess one of the things I'm saying is living with the tension is what I think Jesus was pointing to, and not necessarily resolving it. And to me, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of faith to do that.
Yeah, and I like the tension, especially living with the tension, where you have the in sayings like, if they're not for us, they're against us. If they're not against us, they're for us, which, you know, seems to look in on the subject on both sides. I think the question that I would have for both of you would be, is be ye therefore merciful all that soft of a statement? I recall that in Matthew we already have, you know, God making his rain to fall on the just and the unjust, and the sun to rise on the just and the unjust. And then I'm reminded of a poll of certain group of voters. I don't want to get into the politics right now, in one of our United States, of whom 40% think Islam should be made illegal. And at the same time with the reaction that Muslims should not be allowed to build houses of worship. And part of this, I'm sure at least, is the response to the idea that is going to equate Muslims to terrorists, and that commands such as be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful might fly right in the face of our tendency, say, as Americans, as opposed to as Christians, to say, let's flatten them because they did that to us. So is mercy all that easy of a thing? Are you there, Drew?
I didn't know.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think mercy is an easy thing. I don't think anything that Jesus calls us to do, to be merciful, to mourn, to love, all of these things are easy to do. I mean, they shouldn't be. I mean, if I only love those who love me, or show mercy to those who show me mercy, I'm not really loving and being merciful, I don't think.
I wonder how that, you have the turn, if he strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other cheek as well. That isn't really popular with American Christianity now.
No,
No, but go ahead, David.
That is one of the sermons, one of the ones that I deal with in the book, and it's certainly. In fact, I think I quote. There was, I believe, it was a Baptist minister that said, we will not turn the other cheek, and I think it's one thing to say it's hard to do, but to say that we're not even going to try, it seems like to me that you have capitulated, and how you can still think that you're following Jesus and not even dealing with that, that's beyond me. I don't see how that's possible. But evidently it is.
Yeah. In American Christianity, I suppose it is.
I get it.
As the title of one book puts it, we are a God-blessed but Christ-haunted culture.
Yes, we are.
God blessed but Christ haunted. Yeah, I guess I could see that. So let's move on then, and I'm looking at the time, and I think we're probably going to end up using up the time on this. What would Jesus do is an interesting question. I noticed, David, you took that one on first and then went down to what would Jesus say and all the difficulties. One of my observations about what would Jesus do is that we tend to answer that as more or less what we intended to do in the first place anyway. I recall before the the start of the Second Gulf War, and I should tell people that I'm a veteran of the first. I was in the U.S. Air Force and was involved in the 91 Gulf War. So I've been there and done that. And as the second Gulf War was heating up, I remember seeing a protest here in downtown Pensacola, which has a lot of military presence. And one of the signs read, "Who would Jesus bomb?" And the interesting thing about that is that, those who were in favor of peace were fairly certain that the answer was Jesus would bomb nobody, and those who were already in favor of the warlike actions were quite able to produce their reasons why Jesus would certainly go after the evildoers. Some of the texts would come from Revelation, but nonetheless, it seems like what would Jesus do, and even the what would Jesus do, you wear your what would Jesus do bracelet, but it becomes more of a matter of this is my excuse for doing whatever it was that I was going to do anyway. Drew, am I off on that?
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think we've used that just as a sort of a catchphrase for, as you say, put it on jewelry, put it on bracelets and stuff like that. But, people ask me that question, well, what does the Bible say about this? Or what does Jesus say about this? And what would Jesus do? My answer is usually, I really as to what the Gospels report Jesus saying and doing. But we live in such a much more complex world that I just don't think you can just take, the sayings of Jesus and fit them into this neat little package and stuff like that, because they're not in a neat little package to begin with.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the way I proceeded, because I think Jesus, the one thing he will not let you off the hook. And so you have to struggle with that issue, and it's all that it seems like to me. I keep saying it depends, and the situation is really a big part of it, and in my estimation, it really is. Although it seems like to me there might be, I'd be very there may be a time when we have to go to war, but like we say, it should be the last resort, not the first resort. And with a lot of prayer and everything thrown in, your thing about what we always were going to do anyway reminds me that I think supposedly Henry VIII said, he got down on his knees every night and prayed, and not once did God's will was different than his own, And so I think that's an infection that not only he had.
Yeah. And I think, from a cultural standpoint, our own culture and stuff, even going beyond Jesus, I think what we tended to do is what is expedient for us, what is profitable for us, and we're not thinking morally, and we're not teaching people to think morally about these life-changing and sometimes tragic decisions.
Okay, so could we say something here now? If I want to, if I sincerely say, not what would Jesus do, but to answer the question, what should I do as someone who wants to be a follower of Jesus? Not making the claim, hey, I'm doing some wonderful level of following Jesus, but I am a person who wants to follow Jesus. How do I proceed in trying to come to that, ultimately, while I may be about questions, somewhere I have to make the decision as to what I'm going to do, especially, let's say, if the decision is I'm going to be part of this action of war or not, and there have been young men and women who have made that decision on the steps of the airplane where they were going to deploy to war to say, I'm not going to do this. How do you proceed as a follower of Jesus with exploring that so that you can make a decision that is one of discipleship? David, you...
Yes, well, that's certainly not an easy decision, and I think it's one that takes a lot of struggle, a lot of prayer, and I know it seems like to me that when Jesus included that whole variety of disciples, that you've got maybe even zealots in there as well as probably the pacifists in as well. Still, he was committed to all of those people. And so somehow or another, I think Christ is still Christ for the one who chooses to go to war and the one who chooses to be the conscientious objector. I don't know how we make that any neater or cleaner, but I would hate to say that Jesus is only on the side of one of them.
Drew?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. It's again, we live in such a much more complex world with sovereign nation states that have borders, that have military defense, and there are times when one nation state will be the aggressor towards another nation state, and I think in your war is the last resort. You want to go to diplomacy. You want to work out a diplomatic situation, a political situation, but inevitably sometimes it's going to call for war, and I think that has to be done, thinking seriously about just war theory, but beyond that, I think about peacemaking and how are you going to make peace. I think that Jesus understood in his own situation. Yes, the zealots were around, but I think Jesus understood in his own situation that he was going to challenge Rome on different terms, and he was going to say to Pilate, the representative of Caesar, my kingdom is not of this world. Your kingdom is of this world, but my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is greater. And in essence, even though you're going to put me to death, God's kingdom is going to come. And I think that comes in the way people live and follow Jesus as best as they can.
sounds to me like that gets almost more complicated than the what did Jesus say question that quite a bit.
Oh, it's easy to talk about what Jesus said. It's difficult to talk about what Jesus says to do.
Well, this in the particular example that I gave is kind of personal. My father spent World War II in a camp. They planted trees in Canada as a conscientious objector, whereas I served in the military, as a volunteer, and we were not at enmity over the issue. As a matter of fact, probably nearly every year I write some kind of a blog post when we have, on Memorial Day or Veterans Day, when we have the outbreak of extreme patriotism. I want to comment that we need to also, I served, but we need to also celebrate those who felt that their faith and the fact that they were followers of Jesus could not do so, which was my father's belief.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would certainly hope that, as David said, Jesus is capable of loving people that don't do exactly the same thing.
Last year I was asked to teach senior, we have a thing called Update Learning in town that has courses for seniors. They wanted me to teach Risa Aslan's book, Jesus of Nazareth, the insurrection. And that was an interesting thing to go through, because I finally decided that Jesus was not a pacifist and he was not an insurrectionist. That whatever he was in the middle somewhere or another, but very hard to come down. But it was, if you haven't read that, and I know there's several problems, I think, in some of his biblical interpretation as I went through it, and I could see some holes, and I'm sure Drew could find a lot more. But the idea that Jesus was really out for a worldly kingdom is incomprehensible to me at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I read Aslan's book Zealot, and that's an old theory that's been around a while. And there were numerous New Testament scholars that came out and debunked his. I thought it was a good read, but they just done it. My doctoral supervisor Larry Hurtado actually wrote a blog piece about it and attacking it and stuff like that. And I engaged a little bit with Aslan. He was very cordial and back and forth and stuff like that, but obviously stood by his thesis. But yeah, I would not see Jesus as a zealot. I would tend to think that he had a more non-violent approach to resistance, but resistance nonetheless.
Right.
Okay, well, we have about 3 minutes left. I'll remind everyone I'm speaking with David Cartwright, author of Wounded by Truth, Healed by Love, and Drew Smith, who's the author of Reframing Irrelevant Faith. Both books available from Energeon Publications or on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and a few other places. In the last couple of minutes here, I want to give both of you a chance to have any concluding words that you'd like. David, would you like to start? Do you have anything that you wanted to add?
Other than this has been a very thought-provoking conversation and very enjoyable. So appreciate being included. When you were how we do teaching in classes, I have taught some of this other than Sunday morning. I did a study on the Gospels and portraits of the Gospel, following Tillich and looking at it as and had different artworks to show what kind of Jesus each Gospel was trying to present, and that was a fascinating way. Of course, we didn't come out with the real Jesus. We came out with 4 very nice paintings, but that was fun to do.
Okay, Drew, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate being a part of this conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. I'm looking forward to reading David's book more and getting into it and stuff. I think when you approach teaching in church, setting, which I know is a struggle. You just have to be honest about, you know, the text and all that's behind the text and all that goes into that. I think people, in my mind, it could be unsettling to many, but in my mind, I think people are intelligent enough to deal with it if you present it in a way that says, here's the evidence, let's talk about it.
Okay, well, I thank you both for being with me tonight. I know we had a couple of technical moments where this connection seemed to flash out, so I apologize to our viewers for those, but mostly everything seems to have worked. And we'll welcome you back every Tuesday night. We do have one of these conversations with our authors. Keep track of our website, Twitter feed, and Facebook page, Google+. Any of those will list the events that are coming up. So again, thank you to David Cartwright, Wounded by Truth, Healed by Love, and Drew Smith, Reframing a Relevant Faith, for your participation tonight.